Hello friends, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink. Delayed video. I filmed this last week, but then got the mother of all migraines, so video editing had to take a pause. Anywho, back to these cards. So these were for last week's Color Throwdown challenge, and I started with some white cardstock, and I'm running it through my die cut machine with Simon Says Stamps Peony Bundle 3D embossing folder. Done a couple videos on these different embossing folders. This one just came back in stock a week or so ago, something. So I was like, ooh, finally getting a chance to use it and share with it. You need to experiment with the embossing folders. I've talked about them in other videos. I use a Spellbinders Platinum machine, so I use the embossing folder with the cardstock and then 2 metal shims. On their website, they list like different options for different die cut machines. You can use like scraps of cardstock if you don't have metal shims, all that sort of thing. It's all listed on their site. And sometimes I also talk about lightly misting your cardstock with water. Again, you got to experiment, like what machine you're using, what cardstock you're using, etc. All going to give different results. I found with this one, I found it wrinkled a lot when I used water, like misted the cardstock with water, because I'm just using heavyweight white cardstock. But because there's a lot of flat areas, you know, around the edges, it's not fully patterned like other ones, that the flat areas would get wrinkled, if that makes sense. So what I ended up doing was just cardstock, no water, nothing. They can crack, and mine did a bit, but you can't actually see where it cracked. It's kind of along like the very edges, I guess, of the flowers. Now this video and the photos, I had a horrible time trying to get everything to show up. I went for a very subtle effect here. So I'm filming like white on white, which I've talked about, like even with, you know, heat embossing, that sort of thing, you can't see. And even trying to get like pictures was not easy, but I wanted subtle color. So I'm using Spun Sugar Distress Oxide ink and just a blending brush. And I'm not picking up very much ink, and I'm not pressing. I'm just lightly brushing the blending brush on all those raised edges of these flowers. Now you could use a darker ink. However, if it's darker, there's a chance it'll show up wherever, you know, you kind of go outside the edges of the flowers, like any little smears or anything like that. That like doing something with such a light ink, you can't really tell. You know, if a little bit of ink here and there got where it doesn't belong, I'm using like air quotes that you guys can't see, you're not really going to be able to tell. Because again, I'm using a light hand and also very pale colors, because that was part of the challenge. It was a light pink, a sage green, and gold, and white. And I was like, heck yes. So I'm using Spun Sugar and then Bundled Sage, Distress Oxide inks, and my little blending brushes, and just very, very lightly, you know, brushing that color on just to give it that little, like just a little kiss of color. You know, I didn't want a ton. Again, in real life, these have a little more of an impact. I've been struggling editing this video because it's like, it doesn't look like I'm doing anything. Meh. But yeah, in real life, you can see the detail of the embossing and all that fun stuff. So I went along and just very lightly brushed on that Spun Sugar on the blooms, and then little bits of the Bundled Sage on the leaves. And then once I had those in place, I pulled out this Gold Treasure Gilding polish by Creative Expressions. I had bought this a while ago, it's Cosmic Shimmer. I've used a little like sample container of a different similar stuff that came in one of the card kits like months ago. But I ordered this because it's gold, and I was like, ooh. So I'm very new to this, but it's got its own applicator, which I'm going to use a little bit later. But for now, all I did was I just opened it up, and I'm just using a very dry, this is just a little dry paintbrush, my little Nouveau brushes that I use for all kinds of things. And I'm just kind of picking it up and just kind of doing the same thing, like just rubbing it onto the areas. I just wanted the centers of the flowers and the little like berries, whatever you want to call them, to have that bit of gold. It doesn't need to be perfect. My brush is dry. If you want to be more like detailed and intentional with it, you could probably, you know, use a wet brush, but I didn't want that. I just kind of wanted to rub that color on there. So that's what I did. This stuff dries very quickly. I kind of knew that like going into it, but just another heads up, it does dry very quickly. So then my main image is done. I pulled out the Painted Thanks wafer die that came out a millennia ago. I remember buying this. Is one of the first, like all these painted sentiments were some of my first purchases from Simon Says Stamp way back in the day. I forget how old this is. It's still available, but yeah, just love it. So I die cut it multiple times from white cardstock, and then, as is tradition, stacked 3 layers together, just using my craft tacky glue to give it that depth, you know, that dimension that I really like with word sentiments. And I'm going to do this twice since I'm doing 2 card fronts. And then I'm going to use this gilding polish again. It explains on the bottom of the container like how to use the applicator that comes in the lid. It's just a little foam applicator, but basically you just get it wet. You get it wet, squeeze out the excess. You don't want it dripping wet, obviously. But it's damp. And then I'm just kind of picking up the polish, scraping off the excess because I didn't want like blobs of it, and then just rubbing it onto these die cuts. There's a ton of ways you can use this. I'm going to use it again in a little bit. But I rubbed it on here, and because it dries quickly, it's perfect because then I could layer it multiple times. It took about 3 layers, I think, to get just a nice solid, you know, intense gold finish to this. I think it would work even better if I die cut them from black and then put the gold on top. But regardless, this didn't take very long. I just kind of rubbed it on. I'm working on just some scrap paper here. I get it on my fingers, no biggie. And then the big thing is, as soon as you're done working with it, wash that applicator foam, because you don't want this drawing in there. It'll just solidify and then it'll wreck the foam. So I'd washed it, washed my hands, I'm good to go. This is all dry, so it's all like reflective. I could have die cut like I've shown in a bunch of videos, like from metallic cardstock, but I wanted the centers of the flowers and the sentiment to match, so that's why I used it. So after I did all that, I trimmed down these panels to be slightly smaller than A2 sized. And then after I trimmed them down, I decided that's when I wanted to use the gilding polish again, because why not? So I used it in the similar way. I just picked it up. The foam was still damp. So I picked it up on there, scraped off the excess on the edge of the jar, and then I just edged these panels with it, and it just gives it that little extra something. So then I had to wash the foam again, but again, it takes seconds. So after I was done edging all this, I let everything dry. Dries really quickly, no biggie. So let it dry, make sure that lid's on really good, wash the applicator foam, set it aside. So I've got my sentiments, I have my panels with the edging. Of course I'm going to add splatter. This also doesn't show up on camera. I use Spun Sugar Distress Paint. I've mentioned this in other videos. I'm slowly building up, you know, all the colors in Distress Paint because I love them for splatter. I don't do 3D anything or mixed media really, but I like the paints for splatter. They're perfect and they match. That's what I love. So I use the Spun Sugar paint and lightly splattered. I did not cover these. I just kind of splattered more over the blooms and a little bit, you know, off of it. Subtle, but in real life, just pretty pink, you know, little bits of splatter. So I did that with both of these, and then I'm going to set those aside to dry again. Wash out my brush, wipe off my palette. Distress paints are permanent when dry, so you do not want to leave that paint sitting in your brushes or anything like that. Wash it immediately, just swirl around with some soap and water and you're good to go. So I did my little bit of splattering, cleaned up my tools, and then one of the companion sentiments are the reverse gratitude pre-printed sentiments that I love. I need to order like 10 more packs of these ones. I use a lot. I've shown these in many videos. I've foiled them, all sorts of things. This time I just die cut them with the smallest of the sentiment label wafer dies, and then just trimmed off the ends with my paper trimmer. So I've got this very subtle card front, metallic sentiment, the black sentiment, and then my card base. And this is also where I very much deviated from the norm. You guys see me make A2 cards, slimline cards. I've started doing mini slimline cards. I rarely do 5x7. I get asked about it a lot. It's just not a size I gravitate towards. However, this time they're not quite 5x7. I didn't want 5x7. It didn't match up properly in my head. So these ended up being 5 by about 6.25 inch cards. So basically 5x7, just slightly shorter, but I would use a 5x7 envelope for this. So that way it frames these panels better by cutting them a little bit shorter. So that's what I did. So I cut it to about 6.25 by 10 inches and then scored it at 5. So I have 5 by 6¼ inch cards. And then I brought out my absolutely loved my diagonal stripe stencil. So I have my stencil. I have it in my splat box that I use just for adhesives. And I'm spraying the stencil with pixie spray. Always make sure you're in a well ventilated area or take it outside. I think when I was making this, that was when it was like 50 below. So well ventilated. I just crack open the window for a minute before I freeze. Let everything, you know, air out and we're good to go. So you just spray the pixie spray really lightly. Let it sit for about a minute. It gets tacky. It's awesome. Every time I use this, because I don't use it very often, but every time I use it, I love it. And I did this on purpose because I'm going to have to move these stencils on both these cards to cover it. I need a narrow diagonal stripe like this in a bigger stencil. I think I have one. Possibly Trinity Stamps has one. I got to go through my stash. Anyway, this works though. Another thing I would recommend, don't do what I did. I did my first on just my non-stick craft sheet. Bad idea. I learned my lesson. I ended up wrecking one of the card bases because I'm working directly on the card base. I'm just blending black soot distress ink. I could have used like VersaFine or Simon's Intense Black, that sort of thing. But I wanted an ink that was easy to clean up. And it just, yeah. Non-stick craft sheet, bad idea. Because with the other card base, I ended up ruining because I had ink on the craft sheet and then it got onto the back of the card base. So there's two ways you could fix that. Either just do a separate card front and adhere it to the base. That would work fine. I don't know. I never do that. Hardly ever. Like it just, I don't know. Or do what I do next. And instead of working on the non-stick craft sheet, work on the scrap paper. Because then the ink absorbs into the paper and doesn't transfer all over the back of your card. So that's what I did. So I'm not worried about the centers. I'm not worried if I get smears in the centers. I went with the black soot distress ink also because it's easy to clean off. Like I just wiped the stencil. I use my little blending brush. The pixie spray is holding everything in place. You know, I do all my blending and then it's really easy to quickly pull this up and shift it to the top of the card base. So then I've got that perfect black and white stripe going on. And then all I'm going to do when I'm done my blending is I wipe off the ink, but I leave the pixie spray. It's still tacky. So my stencil's clean, but the back still has that little bit of tack. So I'm going to stick it back in the package and the next time I go to use it, it'll still be a little bit tacky, which is great. If you want to remove the pixie spray for whatever reason, or you have to wash your stencil, it washes off with soap and water. Like just lightly rub it gently between your hands, depending on the type of stencil. One like this, I would rub in the direction of the stripes so I don't bend anything. And then it's good to go. So wiped it off, put it back in the package, and then I've got a little bit of tack on there the next time I pull this out. So I did that, and then on the inside of my cards, I'm using the Say It All Friend stamp set, and I'm stamping the friend word with my absolute favorite, Delicata Golden Glitz pigment ink. You guys have seen me use this in a million videos. Highly recommend it. I always recommend though with the Delicata inks like this, all the metallics, if you get the ink pad, get the ink refill at the same time. Metallic pigment inks, you need to refill them fairly often. It's just the nature of the ink. This gold one is my absolute favorite. It does take a while to dry. I get impatient, but it's worth it. So I stamped the friend word with the Delicata Golden Glitz, and then the other sentiments I just stamped with VersaFine Claire Nocturne ink. I was just using my grid blocks for this. If you want to line things, you know, if you're struggling with lining things up, use a Misty. I just couldn't be bothered this time since I was stamping 3 different stamps to line it up. It was just easier to use my grid blocks. And then the main panel, once the insides are stamped, for the main panel I used foam tape to pop that up. Gives it that bit of dimension. Again, they look so underwhelming in a sense. Like you can't see all the detail. The light, everything, just it was against me making these, but in real life they're so much prettier. But anywho, I adhered the sentiments with craft tacky glue, put acrylic blocks on top of them because I've been adhering on an uneven, like the 3D embossed surface. So that just kind of presses everything down so that those sentiments could adhere. And then the little sentiment strips, I just adhered with little thin 3D foam squares just to pop them up a bit, but not add too much bulk. And then of course I'm going to add a little bit of bling because I can't not. I hoard these little things from Lucy's Cards collections. This is the Sweet Pea Crystal collection. It has like these gorgeous little like hearts. That's what made me use them, because they were very pale pink. So it's perfect for this. And there was some, you know, pale green pearls in the collection, etc. So I just kind of dumped them all out. I had it everywhere. I ended up knocking over the tray. But I got them in place, and then I can go back to hoarding the rest of them like the little miser that I am. So anywho, that was the cards for today's video. As always, I will have a link below the video to my blog post. I'll have a supply list. I'll link to all the supplies I used. Stay tuned. I will have a bunch of videos coming now that I can actually sit and edit without being, you know, dealing with a massive headache. I have a bunch of videos coming, so stay tuned. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing, thumbs upping, commenting, all of it. I very much appreciate it. And I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye!